Today, we're going to discuss why casino ownership and executive management should consider investing in a formal F&B program, especially as a differentiator in the gaming space. I'd like to now ask that each of our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. I'll let you know who we have on. We have Scott Eldridge. He's the GM at Kickapoo Lucky Eagle Hotel and Casino. He's actually going to give you real-life experience and insights from the perspective of casino ownership.
You have disabled sounds.
We have Chris Province, Principal and Marketing Expert with Encompass, John Stewart, Principal and Architect with Encompass Native, and Mike Doocey, Regional VP of Casino Operations at Spectra. So Scott, let's start with you. Can you give us a little bit of insight into your background?
Sure. Good morning, all. Thank you for having me on this panel. I joked that the casino business has been the only adult job I've ever had. I've been in the casino business for about 27 years now, about half and half. First half of my career was commercial gaming in Colorado and Nevada, Las Vegas, and then the last half has been with tribal gaming in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and now Texas.
Great.
I grew up on the marketing hotel side and have been a GM or COO for about the last 12 years now in tribal gaming.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. Let's move on to John while we get Chris straightened out on the audio side.
Yeah, John Stewart, Encompass native. I am an architect, but I grew up with a hammer in my hand too. So also a contractor. Have experience in casinos, hospitality, pretty much you name it. About 15 years ago, we were asked to do our first casino project, and that's kind of where we migrated. So that's our focus, and Chris and I are partners in the Encompass Native business.
Let's go on to Mike. Mike, can you give us a little bit of insight into your background?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Mike Doocey with Spectra Food Services and Hospitality. I do oversee the casino operations group for Spectra. I've been with Spectra for 16 years, and in the food service business, much like Scott talked about much of his adult life, or all of his adult life, I can say that, and I go back to food service even long before that. It's all I, in fact, have ever done. It's a great industry, and really look forward to talking to the group today on the topics at hand.
Fantastic. We're still working on Chris. He'll be on shortly. Mike, can you give a brief overview of how this full series will unfold?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Blair. I appreciate everybody being on the call today, both our listeners and our panelists. To the panel, obviously, this is a team that we speak to frequently about the topics at hand. And we really thought it'd be of value to get together as a group and talk about the different aspects of food and beverage program. I think oftentimes we kind of look at food as a necessity, right? It's something that everybody needs on the Maslow's chart, if you will. But coming down to it and how it can be used as a tool and an amenity in the gaming environment, I believe is a great topic to talk about. And it has many aspects to it, from the kickoff of the governance of a program and the overall resources that are needed to the fine-tuning of an actual strategy and on to the actual implementation and then review. So we took that and said, well, that's a lot to cover in one afternoon, or morning as it be, and we broke that down into a four-topic series to cover each of those segments over the course of the next few months. I believe that we'll be putting together our panelists, and a few different panelists on each occasion that are experts in each of these different areas. So, of course, today we're talking about really the kickoff of a program. But as we venture forward, we'll talk about the experts in different aspects of the program through the series.
Great. Thank you, Mike. All right. So as Mike said, let's talk about the topic at hand today. If you're listening to this webinar, you may have already identified the need for a change within your operation. It might just be an inkling of a thought, or you might be a little bit further down the road. Mike, can you give us a brief overview of exactly where we begin today, how we establish next steps, who should be a part of the conversation, establishing parameters?
Well, I think that the kickoff really starts a little bit further back than that, and it would say, why? Maybe the question is why invest in a food and beverage program? And I might chat here with Scott for a minute because that's something that Scott and I have had the opportunity to talk about, over the years that we've known each other, and I would kick it off by saying. Being a food person, I don't mean to intend to slight the gaming business. That's what we're in. But I would kick it off to say that as we recognize the casino product and the games that are available to the guests, many of those products from a gaming perspective are very similar between various casinos in a given market. The slot companies and manufacturers produce very similar machines that are available. A lot of great new products out there, but generally available to all the casinos in competition. So the question to me has always been, and one that I've been posed as a food and beverage director and then VP, is how do we use food to make that a differentiator for the brand of the casino? I mean, Scott, that's a fair statement, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think Harris did research years ago that has always rang true, any analysis or research we've ever done, which is simply people play where they eat and eat where they play, right? And as a casino operator, we're always looking for ways to do one of two things, either generate more trips or to extend that time of the trip, right? Extend the time on device and extend the time on the property. And so food is a key component of how we can do both of those things.
Can we talk a little bit more about how food can be the differentiator? You mentioned, Scott, getting people to play where they eat where they play. Can we elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I think, again, depending on the market and the competition you have, right? But as Mike mentioned, you want food to be the differentiator. You want it to be one of the reasons that they come to your property instead of your competitors, right? And that doesn't at all mean that you have to have the nicest or the most expensive restaurants. It means quite simply that you have to have what your players want. And then you have to be able to execute that, whatever that is, consistently with high quality. So it could be hot dogs, right, if that's what your market wants, but you better execute them, consistently every time. So I think the key is how you can differentiate yourself starts with what's your player base, who's your market, and what do they want. And that's the hardest thing to do, in my opinion, when you're talking about a food and beverage program and what type of restaurants you should have, is that you have to let the player data dictate that. It doesn't matter what I want, with all due respect to our ownership groups. To some level, it doesn't matter what they want. What do our players want? What are they comfortable eating? What do they like to eat? What is good in this market? And how can we take that and execute it properly so that we can generate those additional visits and longer stays when people do visit?
Yeah, and to add to that, Scott, I think food, and pardon me, Mike Doocey speaking, the food can add, any of the number of elements of food can add energy to the casino. You talked about, having the right product for the guests. And you could further define that to say that food and beverage is both food and beverage. So we could be talking about, from a restaurant to fast food to even the bars and entertainment side of food and beverage, which would be perhaps in some circumstances nightclubs or live entertainment venue, perhaps even a theater. So, when we're talking about oftentimes food and beverage, there's other components and other segments of service and amenity that are tied into that. Pools are an example in some casinos that are utilized. I live in, of course, I live in Phoenix, Arizona. If those on the call have ever traveled to the Salt River Casino, they have had a lot of success with a weekend pool function because of their proximity to Scottsdale. A lot of energy, a lot of nightlife entertainment going on in that area. So they've definitely capitalized on that to draw people to the facility. So I think it's really kind of a three-dimensional look at not just it's not just food for eating, it's food for entertainment and the kind of the spin-off products that can be created as a result.
Yeah, and Mike, I apologize for interrupting you. This is Scott again. I agree, and I think where that comes from is that there has to be a strategy, right? There has to be a food and beverage strategy, and that strategy has to be an extension or at least a very strong complement to your overall casino strategy, right? Sometimes we've all seen properties where there's a disconnect. The people playing the slot machines and the table games are very different than what the dining experience is, right? So I always have to remember we're in the casino business, right? And so every part of our strategy, especially food and beverage, needs to complement and support that casino strategy. So there has to be a strategic effort behind
right.
It. Sorry.
No, I think that's a good point. I think that we often see in the early side, as you know, we kind of hinted towards earlier of the topics of today. I think we see in the early side a lot of discussion around, but what is the right thing to do, and kind of getting to the heart of it today. You know, coming to the conclusion of what is the match and what is the differentiator brands and ideas that you're going to bring forward. I think oftentimes we have you know, a variety of opinions and thoughts as to how that can be driven. And Scott, in our paths together, I think we've worked through a number of data sets, not just one. Some of it is as one of our marketing folks say in Spectra, some of it is instinct, right? We certainly rely on experience and instinct and past success and look to apply that. But don't you think some of that is also the kind of the data driven and looking at how that comes together?
Yeah, no, it definitely has to be, right? There's the old saying, trust but verify, right? Those of us that have been in the business a long time, we can trust that our intuition and our experience is leading us down a path, but you always have to make sure that the research and the data behind it supports that. And I think that's the thing that's missing. And a lot of times when people dive into, hey, let's remodel our restaurants or let's build new restaurants, is take that step back and really dive into the data, the research of your player base, of who you're attracting now, who you want to attract, and really understand that dynamic before you begin. That's the first step of the strategy in my mind, is look at that data and make sure it supports. We've all got great ideas. Ownership will offer great ideas, and that's wonderful. And it all may sound great. Let's make sure the data supports it.
Right. And I think it kind of comes down to, and you know, starting to maybe John will kind of, you know, we talk a little bit about design and scope and all of the people that should be at the table in developing those initial thoughts, realistic initial thoughts. You know, we look at it and say, at least from a food, from a food side, Scott, you know, from the casino side, maybe it's a little bit different, but from the food side, we're looking at it and thinking, okay, so we have a space, or we're going to remodel a space, or we're going to expand a space because we all agreed that there's a need to either improve existing food or expand to growth the number of seats available for guests, or perhaps another factor that's driving the initial thought of change, and we come down to, so how do you kick that off, right? I mean, how do we put all those things together? And one of the things that I think oftentimes has to get discussed very, very early, in addition to the marketing and the realistic side of the guest one, what can the facility actually sustain? And John, I mean, you've been around a lot of projects and probably have seen instances where, you know, somebody is looking for a very grandiose concept. You know, I think we all talked a little bit, you know, about Cheesecake Factory as an example. I mean, look at that very large, very expensive restaurant that charges $14 for martinis and, you know, $20 for a plate of pasta. They're big portions, but they do that because of the mathematics that comes in related to the construction side, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've studied any of those types of restaurants like them, they're really specific about knowing and understanding their customers. That's why you see a lot of them at malls, where you've got that captured, customer that's going to sit down for long enough to spend $20 on a plate of pasta and eat it all. A big difference when we look at and really what we talk about is more the experience, and that experience tied together than that one event, for the casino customer. So we're talking about the overall experience and how do we enhance that. You were talking about data. One of the things that we use a lot in our design, we use it all the time now in our design just because the information is there, is really neuroscience and how are memories created. And, you bring that into the very front end when we're analyzing all the data. I tell people we know a lot about a customer or a player. There's their slot machine player. We know how often they play, what they play, how much they spend every visit, what it takes to get them there. What we miss a lot of times though is when they were sitting that machine or when they were going to food and beverage, what's the environment that they were in? And so we're able to now take that and add it on to the data that we already have and design to actually enhance memory and get people out there telling the story about the spaces and places. So all that's, and as you mentioned, Mike, it's really important to have that team up front in the process.
Yeah, and I think we confront sometimes then on the restaurant side, and we love the design phase, John, and we love working with the architects, but we often confront that balance between the functional side of the design, the form side of the design, and then again coming back to what is realistic, back to what Scott was talking about, number of guests, data set that you can bring in. If you build that 100-seat restaurant that costs $5 million to build, you're probably never going to make the money back, right? I mean, it's a very expensive endeavor, right? So sometimes I think that it's so important, to your point, to have a designer in the early phase to set some realistic ideas of, folks, this is what it really costs to do that. Now, the flip side to that is, when you're asked to just simply improve a restaurant, or if it's already it's a miss, right? Some brands, we know, everybody I'm sure has heard, restaurants oftentimes fail. It's a lot of times that there are misses, and there's a lot of reasons that plays in, but a restaurant has to, at least in our opinion of food and beverage, I'd love to hear, Scott, your thoughts, but we always think that it's got to be like a story. It's got to read like a book. It's got to have a character. It's got to have persona. The staff expect that. The staff want to tie on to a product brand that they know. They're part of a theater. They're part of a stage. And it's not simply just, hey, I've got plates, forks, knives, and food, and I'm serving that. Those days are long gone of those types of restaurants, right? I mean, that type of define just a restaurant where people go eat is long gone. So now they are entertainments, and there's all sorts of games and things to do in restaurants and activities, and we hear about, let's build a sports bar. Even sports bars are kind of to some extent, in my opinion, a little bit passé as a function. Not that you can't have a bar with sports and have sports-centric, but it has to have more to it than that to attract guests and to energize the staff to be a part of that structure. So all of a sudden, you're balancing, how do the staff react, what's the brand, how much does it cost, and back to how many guests can you get. Now, but Scott, sometimes in a casino, right, the goal isn't necessarily the volume as it relates to pure profitability of the income statement for the restaurant, right? And they have to balance that in as well. They could be investing in a little bit of loss on a regular basis if indeed it's serving the primary engine, as I think someone said earlier, we're in the casino business, right?
Right. No, exactly. And just to touch base on what you said, I couldn't agree more. The expectation of the diner in the last 5 to 10 years has changed dramatically. And now they are expecting an experience. Right? And so there's multiple ways to deliver that experience, but they want that, I call it the Instagram moment, right? And that is, they want this dining experience. We can't quote unquote get away with what we were able to do with food 10 years ago. The diner's expectation and sophistication has changed dramatically. But to get to your other point, Mike, I think, yeah, and then the key with that is that you need to discuss and identify what those goals are really at the very beginning. We're going to invest in building or remodeling restaurants. What's the goal to do that, and what's the expectation? Are these restaurants expected to be profitable? Are they expected to break even? We're not as concerned about food costs. We just want to drive traffic. That's leaning more towards the casino model, right, that you do these things to drive traffic, create experiences in your building that are going to drive traffic to additional trips or longer trips like we talked about earlier. But you have to have those conversations and understand what's realistic, and then make sure ownership understands that yes, we're going to invest, to use your example earlier, Mike, we're going to invest $5 million into a 100-seat restaurant. It is never going to be profitable, but it's going to achieve these objectives, and that's why we're doing it. And those conversations need to take place very early on with your board or your ownership group so that the expectations are clear of what are the expectations of their investment.
Yeah, and Scott, if I can piggyback on that real quick. This is Chris, so it's good to be here. You speak to identifying those business objectives like really early on, like, beginning with the end in mind, and having, like, at that point, kind of that right team involved. And once those business objectives are set, really diving into understanding the current state and getting into the right research and having the right team of people to execute that research so that you know what your gap is between what you're currently operating and what your players are currently experiencing to where ultimately you have to be. And really getting into the fine details of what your player behaviors are, both in and outside the property, in order to inform the plan to achieve those objectives. So if you know that 65% of your players eat at a casino 2 or more times a month, if you know that your highest gaming contribution comes from players that dine with you 4 to 6 times a month, if you know what their perceptions are of your venues, even their demographic profiles, whether, what is their favorite food style? Is it American? Is it Pac Rim? Is it Mexican? Knowing that the players may eat Asian food out, like they're twice as likely to eat Asian food in a restaurant that is full service than they are to eat it at home. So as you start to think about, is it quick service casual? Is it full service? It's really the preferences and the perceptions of the players the business decides to listen to. And that's the beautiful thing about marrying research with the player tracking information. We're able to append the data and say, this is what your high limit players think. This is what your mass market thinks. This is what your mid-market thinks. These are the different perceptions of those venues. And certainly anytime there's a brand component or a property is discussing brand affinity or licensing, it's always good to go out and ask, what brands or chefs do they have affinity for? And, we found that, you take a Giada, she's going to have a different level of affinity and to a different level of player than, say, an Akira Bach. So even as you bring in brands and chefs, appending into that player data becomes very imperative in order to achieve those business objectives.
And
I think this is Scott again. Sorry, Blair, go ahead.
Oh, no, Scott, please.
Well, so I was going to say, Chris, just by listening to you, and I agree with everything you just said, you can tell the level of detail and the complexity that this can take on. This just isn't as simple as, hey, let's go build a McDonald's, right? Nothing against McDonald's, but there's just a tremendous amount of research and analysis that goes in. And so as the operator on the panel, I would say that's why it's been important to me is bring the experts in to help you do this. As the operators, any operators that are on this webinar today, don't think you have to do this on your own. From the beginning stages of doing player surveys like Chris was just talking about and understanding, researching your player base in the market, there are people out there, experts that can help you do that. And then, of course, on the food and beverage side, the same thing. There are experts in these fields, and I would say from the operator standpoint, that's something I've learned over the years is that don't try to do this by yourself. There are experts out there on all the things that we've touched on today, and I would encourage people to talk to those people and if possible, engage them to help you through this process.
Well, we've talked a lot about data and science-driven research and design. Well, how do we address the discrepancy between that and personal or recency bias with those who are sitting around the table with you?
This is Scott again. I'm sorry to laugh. That's the hardest part of the job, right? Because we all have personal preferences. We all have likes and dislikes. We all have, especially when it comes to food, right? Everybody eats. Most people cook. So we're all experts, right? So everybody, that's the hardest part. And I think, in my opinion, the way that I've had some success doing that is showing your board or your ownership group all that research and data that John and Chris have been talking about to really, and you have to be careful and respectful about it, to say, hey, I know we all like this type of restaurant or this type of food, but that's not what our player base is looking for. That's not what our market enjoys. We need to give them what they want. A silly example is if our current database here is about 61, 62% female. Well, one of the suggestions when we started this process is let's do a Hooters, right? Everybody loves the wings at Hooters. Well, that doesn't fit our demo, our market at all, right? And that's a very simple high-level example. Chris could go into much more detail of that, but that's the type of thing you're combating. And I think how you can overcome that is let the data dictate, right? It doesn't matter what I like to eat. With all due respect, it doesn't matter what my board of directors likes to eat. It's what does the research tell us that our players want in a dining experience.
Right, and there's the little identifiers too, as well, Scott. Mike Doocey speaking. It's when we're building, the finite details of the bar and the menu experience. It can boil down to what type of beer you put together, because you're associating branded beer. I mean, the liquor companies spend millions, hundreds of millions in advertising and brand positioning, and if you're building a bar in a certain area where the income might be a little bit lower, or perhaps it's a rural area, but you're positioning Belvedere as a vodka, that might not relate to the guests. You might need to position a Bud Light, and I'm getting into the granular of a food and beverage menu positioning, but all of those things then backtrack to the overall concept. You're not going to build a simple beer bar and spend, with John's time on the architecture side, a ton of resources and money and expense if that's not the look you're going for, right?
Yeah, this is John. I wanted to jump in there. Some of the stuff that everybody's been talking about. A lot of times as an architect, we're the first person the owner calls, and as an architect, I can tell you that's probably not the right thing to do, because everybody likes to get to the stuff. I think you said, Mike, earlier, you said, that's the fun part, the design and all the construction stuff. That's the part that we can touch and feel and see and get excited about. And we have an idea that an architect can make come to life. And I think that the first thing we do is ask all these questions that that Scott was talking about and Chris was talking about. We need to know these answers before we start any pencil on paper or line on a computer. I think it's really important to understand, one of the questions we talked about is who sits at the table at this phase. And I can tell you from an architect's perspective, don't just go hire an architect and run off and do a restaurant.
John, I appreciate you saying that. This is Scott again. The thing I would add to that is that from the very beginning of that process, whenever you engage with that architect, is have an ops person, a food and beverage, a knowledgeable, experienced food and beverage ops person along for the ride the entire way. Because, John, your company and other architects do beautiful work, but they have to be functional from an operational standpoint. And so having that experienced ops person throughout the process with the architect can make a huge difference. I've done it both ways and learned the hard way. You want that ops person involved from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and
I've ran.
Sometimes, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say just an example, kind of the for example piece on the operations side. Like a lot of times, even the sourcing and the buying strategy for the F&B program will have an effect on the space needed. So if it's not designed to, purchase 6 months worth of beef supply in advance, and the budgets and the cost projections all kind of rely on that, we end up in a really bad spot operationally. So, everything from how you buy to, the logistics of how you move food in and out of the kitchen informs that design. So when you jump into design without the operational influence from the property, the people that are actually setting the budgets and how they're going to get there from the sourcing side, I think that's another fail point or a place where we see that fall apart at times.
Chris, you've worked in the kitchens with us in some of the worst kitchens. I'm guessing you got that spot on. I mean, there is no doubt that from a foreman function, oftentimes there's pretty big misses. I met an architect once, not John, but and I'll leave names out of it, but who said, you food guys, you care more about the functionality of the kitchen and really, you got to have a beautiful design. In fact, he went on to say that, look at all these, small mom and pop restaurants that have been operating for so many years, and they're able to produce all this food with these small kitchens, and everyone is looking for, a functional kitchen, and they get bogged down in that during design. Well, that's just wrong. You have to have a functional kitchen. In fact, many of those, if you will, mom and pop restaurants that have done very well or well known in small areas and have produced great products out of very small spaces, but they've done so organically over decades, and they've done that as a development. The time involved here in these buildings does not allow for that. You have to get it right from the start. You're building brands. Ponder for a second how many brands pre-existed, say, an Olive Garden before it went national, right? Many, right? There were many failures to get it to where it was before it became the brand that you may know today. And so it's not as simple as just simply saying, well, because you have equipment and you can cook the food, thus you can build it. And I was also going to say, there's aspects of the reality back to John's world of what you can even build. Again, I might have mentioned earlier, if you do not have the proper, what I think, John, in your world you referred to as MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, that's set up, you could easily, John, double, triple your cost of a build out or remodel?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, think about trying to run a welded duct through 2 stories or 3 stories or even a hotel above you. Those become real issues.
Well, and I think, again, this is Scott, from the operator perspective, anytime you do a project, you have your budget, and then you usually have to try to find ways to value engineer. And I would, again, just urge caution. The non-cool, the non-sexy part of any restaurant is that MEP in the back of house kitchen. But you can really do yourself harm. You can have a beautiful, gorgeous, very exciting front of house, and if you skimped on the back of house, your restaurant's going to fail. And so just that's something to keep in mind, as it's easy to say, oh, we don't really need that piece of equipment, or we don't really need to redo the hoods, or whatever it may be. And again, speaking from experience, learning the hard way, it doesn't matter how cool your restaurant is if the kitchen can't produce. And so, again, have some experts involved when looking at that equipment. If you're dealing with third-party brands, they're going to dictate a lot of that. They'll have specific equipment specs. which helps kind of protect you from yourself. But if you're doing it internal, just make sure that's not an area, in my opinion, where you want to skimp or value engineer, because that production has to be spot on. It's behind the scenes, non-sexy part of a new restaurant, but that part has to work.
You know, Scott, we were going to talk in a further series, actually our second part of the series, more about the details of the strategic plan, which would include brand selection, as you mentioned. But since you brought it up, I mean, even in the early side, from a marketing perspective, you know, Chris and Scott might be able to weigh into this, but we've been involved with the early discussions of, you know, that other aspect you mentioned. Do you go brands, national brands, regional? Do you partner with a chef? And so then you're adding yet another layer to the project that, you know, you have to identify at least from some high-level mathematics to make sure that, you know, if you choose to have those types of discussions early on, that you know that you're going to have initial key money, as they call it, that license money, upfront money to the brands, ongoing royalties. You may be obligated to purchase equipment from them. You may be obligated to purchase specifically their supplies through their network of supply chain management and so on. You know, I mean, that's something, Scott, I know that we've talked about. Chris, I mean, I'm sure you've seen that, and that's a big decision, right? Early on, that's a big decision.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, obviously the brands have built-in affinity, and that's why they offer some level of value. The casino space is also pretty hot for national brands to try and enter right now. So there's just such a, does it fit with the purpose of the property, right? Does it align with the brand? I think that's ultimately the question. And is the brand reliant on destination visits, or is the property reliant on destination visits, or is it has some level of local control that provides the majority of its revenue? Is it a high intercept type of location? So there's a lot of things to consider. Again, to the point earlier, it's not as easy as like throwing up a McDonald's. There's a ton of things to consider. For some properties, national brands, perfect, great, awesome. For some, there's just no need. It's just an added expense, you know, for some properties. And
I agree with Chris. I agree with that, Chris, wholeheartedly. Yeah, I mean that expense. You know, the one that I commonly recommend, Mike Doocey speaking, I commonly recommend that, you know, be cautious with some brands because you may not need them. You know, take the diner for example, that's producing primarily. You know, some of the top 5 items will generally be the breakfast items, right? So do you really need a brand to identify to sell eggs and bacon and potatoes? On the other hand, you can into the discussions of if you're putting together a food court or maybe perhaps a higher end marketplace concept, maybe there's a balance of brands. And then some casinos gravitate towards wanting a steakhouse, which, by the way, is its own discussion. Do you need a steakhouse? It seems to be a common theme that there's a feeling you must have a steakhouse, and I'm not sure I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, if we can, let's take it up one level and actually talk a little bit. Alyssa had submitted a question and kind of taking it above the individual brands, but how does food help create the guest casino brand loyalty? Not just recognition of the brands that you're putting in there, but how do you get these folks, whether it's, I think you said, the destination visits versus the local traffic? How do you facilitate that guest casino brand loyalty?
I'll take a high level stab and maybe pass it over for some more detailed. Ultimately, I think clarity of purpose for the casino itself is key. Like the individual brands. I'm going to take the position that the brands you put in your casinos do not matter as much as the purpose you have for the property itself and how that purpose is driven into those verticals. So the leadership practices that drive the why of your property into your food and beverage program, that's ultimately what creates the loyalty. If everything rises and falls on leadership, kind of how that global strategy is driven into these verticals is everything. And I look to Scott to kind of share the kind of what do you do, Scott? How do you take what you stand for and your values as a senior leader and what you believe will make the enterprise successful and drive it into either, licensed or non-licensed branding options?
No, yeah, well said, Chris. And I think, like we mentioned earlier, number one, you have to have the strategy, right? And then number two, these brands have to fit that strategy. And some of that is obviously the experience and the food type and the style of restaurant, of course, but there's also that brand's culture. Does that fit well with you? There may be some very strong, very well-run brands out there that just don't simply fit who you are or who you want to be as a company and as a casino. They may not fit what the tribe is trying to accomplish or the culture of your organization. And so that's getting back a little bit on the brand side of it, right, is to understand that brand as well, too. The most well-known and popular brands, generally speaking, are also going to be the most strict and the least flexible, and a term we've kind of coined a brand dictator, that you want to be careful when you're going into business with them. Not that that's a bad thing, but you better understand that. It's not like you're going to bring a Starbucks in and be able to change the way they do business to fit your company culture. If Starbucks doesn't fit how you do business and your market and your player base and your culture, then no matter how great of a brand Starbucks is, you probably shouldn't put a Starbucks in your casino. So I think it starts with understanding. Yeah.
Well, and we've
got
a...
And the other thought, the other thought too with that decision is, Scott, those are great thoughts. And the other part of that is the personnel that you need to hire to manage those brands, right? So if you're in an area where you, going back to the steakhouse model, and you want to think about building a steakhouse, but in that market there is nothing of its kind, drawing steakhouse employees is not something that you're going to do from, it takes years to learn that aspect of service. You're learning wine, you're learning scotch, you're learning elements of food. Servers in a mid-casual restaurant like the Olive Garden I mentioned, or a Denny's in the diner area, they can pretty quickly learn the service steps needed to sell the food. But if you're trying to sell somebody an $85 plate of food with all the accompaniments and wine, they need to know food inside and out, and that is not something that is learned in the matter of a year or two. I mean, you're talking about years of work of going through and being the maitre d', maybe becoming a food runner, perhaps even spending time in the kitchen. There's a lot of disciplines involved in food service from a personnel side that will make or break that outlet, and it has to be considered when you're putting the brand together.
And absolutely, Scott, again, you have to be able to execute it. Again, it may be a great brand, a great concept, a great dining experience, but if you can't execute it, if you and your team can't execute it, then don't do it. I mean, a very simple, high-end example, but Ruth Chris is an incredible dining experience for a steakhouse. But if you're going to put a Ruth Chris in and then you can't execute it, you're going to be in worse shape than you were before you put it in. Would you be better off putting in, and again, no affinity to brands or anything else, but an Outback Steakhouse, because your team and your market can execute that. And it's better to have a good steak consistently all the time than to try to pull off a Ruth Chris experience and you just can't execute it.
And I think this is a great spot to tie back to, like, why it's not about us. This is Chris. And it's not about our personal affinities. A lot of times we'll see some sort of organizational, somebody that's up there in the power hierarchy of the organization. They go out of market. They have a meal in some place that has a lot of critical mass and has an abundant employee base, and they have this great dining experience, and they say, let's do that here. And we as operators, we get, okay, well, I guess this is what we're doing, and we get into this situation. To your point, Scott, we don't have the critical mass of potential employees. We don't have the knowledge base in our market, and I would state that the number one, or the most costly and probably one of the most common mistakes that we see is in fine dining or steakhouse program execution. A lot of times you see a la carte places try to go into rural markets. I just guarantee that in a month they're running $19.99 dinner specials. because it just doesn't work. And
absolutely,
and I'll say that your players know, and I'm going to share a nugget that hopefully offers some value to some other folks on the call. But over half of your players watch food-related programming on television, and 57% identify themselves as a foodie. So when we're developing food and beverage programs, this idea is like, oh, it doesn't have to be great, or we don't have to get into that level of detail, is absolutely false. Because the programs that win understand that their players are out there watching the food programming, trying new things at home. They're on the, Eat Fresh or Blue Apron. They're doing these things, and when they go into a casino and we're less educated or less able to execute than they are personally, what kind of light that shines on the operation.
Chris, I couldn't agree more. This is Scott again. I would just want to add that the nuance that being great does not mean it has to be an $85 steak, right? That's not the expectation of our guests, and I'm speaking very macro right now, but they want quality, fresh, made to order. That's what they're looking for. It could be a salad. It could be a sandwich. It doesn't have to be a Ruth Chris type level experience, right? But it just has to be quality. And so I want everybody to understand, with what we're talking about doesn't mean it has to be this great high-end brand. It can be a mid-level dining experience. It just has to be quality and consistent.
I think that goes, this is John again, I think that goes, it's the same to what the food that you serve and the way they handle it needs to match the space and that we create for those venues as well. And a lot of times we focus on things that nobody will ever remember when they leave, and we spend a lot of money on that stuff. So it ties in really, really well with having an experienced team all the way around that knows how to build it, how to operate it, how to design it, and where all that comes from.
So we've talked quite a bit about leadership, who should be at the table, who are the decision makers up front, the guests, operations, brand. We've talked a little bit about employees. If you bring in a steakhouse, are there potential employees in the market who have that knowledge? Well, what about the existing team? How do you promote change with a team without hindering current service? And how do you get the buy-in from the employees when promoting that change?
If I can jump on that one first, I think we want engaged team members. Engaged team members are going to be loyal to the brand. So those are the team members that are going to be able to develop their skill set under the brand, and those are the team members you're going to be able to retain. So to engage the employee base, first thing is clarity of values. Like, what does the brand stand for? Like, here's what we believe. Here's what our objective is. Here's our why. Like, making sure that the team member has clarity of the organization or the brand value for the venue that they're working in, and allowing them to participate in whatever ways possible, whether it's suggested menu design, if it's feedback on a food, if it's any way possible to get them participating, and then supporting them with the right tools. So if they're very clear about the values of that individual venue or how it fits into the larger picture of the property, making sure that their personal values align with the space that they're working in. So here's what the organization believes, here's what the person believes, and allowing them to participate and give them the right tools, that's what will get the commitment.
And there's a little bit of capitalist ideal in there, right? I mean, the brand's got to work. It's got to be successful. They're working for tips. They do not want to work. Servers are, very unique. Bartenders very unique and specialized trade. It is one that they want to go where the brand works. They know they can smell out the brands that are good and the ones that aren't, and the ones that are managed well. And Chris, you're spot on those topics. I couldn't agree more. The tools are important. How John designs it's important. How it's marketed, how it's governed is all key, and the staff will feel that, and they will not stay if they're feeling they're not going to make money. They're kind of partners in the business, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This is Scott again, and I agree with everything you guys said. You know, at an organizational structured level, you're 100% spot on. And then when you drop that down in kind of in the day-to-day operations, Mike, you're right. While you need to explain the why to them, at the end of the day, many of them just care, what's in it for me? Am I going to make more money in this new restaurant or at this new bar? And so explaining the overall why and the purpose behind what you're doing is very important. And then how does it impact them as individual team members? Because change is scary, right? So even if we all think it's a cool change and we did all our research and it's the best move ever possible for this company, at the end of the day, we're still impacting our team members' lives because it's changing. And so one way we've had a little bit of success with that is, and again, I would kind of encourage as a macro kind of concept today, is, you know, I get it. We want to get these things built and done and open and generating profit or driving traffic or whatever the objective is, but don't rush that training pre-opening process. The more comfortable your team can be in their new, they're already uncomfortable because you changed their environment, right? Or they're in a new environment because you hired them to work this new restaurant. So the more time you can spend with training and pre-opening so that they're as prepared as possible and really as comfortable as possible before you open to the public, I would encourage people, I know there's a financial impact to that, but don't rush that pre-opening. Do everything you can to get that team as comfortable as you can before you open to the public.
Yeah. And I think it's keeping that long-term focus. And yeah, we can not spend as much training. We can, you know, try to do our pre-opening in 3 days instead of 2 weeks and save a few $1,000s. But when we think about long-term in the casino business, like giving that staff confidence, because it's the confidence that the guest ultimately is going to pick up on. It's that confidence and that ability to execute that's going to earn that team member their tips and their wage. And, you know, I don't think it's out of line to support our team members and say, hey, you know, like we're here to make sure that everybody earns a great wage too. And you know, supporting that staff in that way and them to have that confidence in their leadership, that their leadership is looking out for their wage as well, I think is prudent.
Great. Are there any, we've covered a lot of ground. We're in the final few minutes of the webinar. If anybody from the field or anybody who's listening in on this webinar has any questions, please type them in at the Q&A at the bottom. We're happy to answer them in the next couple minutes. But what I will ask is, you know, if each panelist has a very brief closing thought that you think really, you know, puts the period on the end of this webinar, I invite you to do so.
This is Scott. From the operator perspective, I would just encourage, again, kind of a general statement, but do as much homework and research as you can up front. Don't be in a hurry to say we need to remodel our restaurants this month. Really take a step back, understand the data, have those overall top-level strategic conversations with your board or your ownership group, and understand so everybody's on the same page of this is the strategy we're going to use, these are the objectives we're trying to achieve, and this is the way we're going to go about that, so that there's no surprises with the investment you're about to make, that everybody understands the path you're on.
Thank you, Scott.
And for me, a couple of things. I just, you know, I'll go back to data, you know, research. I think there's always this conversation about, is a casino restaurant an attraction or a service? Your guests are going to be split 50-50 on that, which gives us as operators and marketers a lot of leeway. So half your guests are going to look at a casino restaurant as an attraction, half of them are going to look at it as a service. As far as future area of opportunity, like right now we're seeing about 40% of our respondents saying they would utilize game-side dining if it were available. So looking at your game-side programs, if that fits within your brand's purpose and your strategy, I think there's a lot of guest satisfaction points to be had looking forward into that space.
And this is John, just a really quick statement. Invest up front and the payback will be there. If you invest up front in the right team, those with knowledge in the industry, just like what we've heard today, I think, no doubt that will be your investment you'll see returns on that, even if there's a decision not to do what you'd hope to do.
Fantastic.
And this is Mike.
And Mike, if you can find, and along with your closing thought, can you kind of lead us into what part 2 will look like?
It's part and parcel. Thank you. Yes. I mean, my thought would be is once those that represent the ownership get together, folks like Scott, folks on the marketing teams like Chris, and you have the concept of what you can reasonably do from a design and development side with experts like John, you then need to move out of the parameter goal setting phase that we talked about today of coming together, of deciding what you need to do from a broad scope, and then begin to let as somebody said earlier, let the experts then develop an F&B strategy. And we're going to talk about that in our next series and really drilling down to the mechanics and more the mathematics side, the operational side, and fine-tuning and honing the granular detail of building a plan that's realistic and setting up, again, I mentioned parameters, setting up parameters to provide and prevent something that we'll talk about at length next time, but that is scope creep, where you can make right turns that are unwanted in the project that can cost you time, money, delays, and really confuse the overall project itself.
Fantastic, and that is time for us. Scott, Chris, John, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure everybody listening is learning quite a bit, at least how to start off this process, everything to think of down the line before it happens. Please, everyone, do keep an eye out for the next invitation for part 2, as Mike said, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you guys very much.